Hi everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to be here today and watch our presentation. My name is Harley Hawthorne and this is Nathan Kotis, and we are going to be presenting on Pepsi's top risks.
So PepsiCo is a well-known business that was established in 1898 by Caleb Bradham. In 1965, they merged with Frito-Lay to create a company that served not only beverages, but salty snacks as well. They operate in over 200 countries around the globe and are headquartered in New York.
So the environment in which PepsiCo operates is definitely notable in terms of this presentation because it changed how we prioritize the risks. So obviously PepsiCo is a large market cap company. They operate in a very highly concentrated market with several companies that basically dominate the industry, and we included an image to illustrate this. So these are the big Nestle, Coca-Cola, Kraft, Kellogg, Pepsi, etc. Those are the big food and beverage companies that definitely dominate it. And with that in mind, it definitely changes how we saw the risk because they have access to a lot more capital, they have access to a lot more resources, and they also have access to a lot more means to mitigate their risk than other companies of a smaller size would. In terms of they can afford to access captive insurers, they can afford to have much higher limits of self-retention, things like that. So we definitely tried to keep the environment in mind when analyzing these risks. So the mission statement and values of PepsiCo are: the mission is to create more smiles with every sip and every bite. We definitely saw this as a weakness of PepsiCo. We definitely felt like it was a risk for Pepsi because it doesn't outline what they stand for, what they believe in, what they hope to do. We just felt like it was a very rudimentary almost mission statement, and that definitely could be mitigated a lot better. Their vision is a little bit more specific, but even then it's still pretty vague. And their competitor, Coca-Cola, which I will talk about on the next slide, is definitely a lot more specific with their mission statement. So that's definitely a risk moving forward. And then we also wanted to note that the competitive advantage of Coca-Cola is that they are a cost leadership company, so they are cheaper than their biggest competitor, Coca-Cola.
So this is an image of the mind map that we created, and it outlines the risk within the four sections of the risk that PepsiCo has. So under financial risk, we have risk of inflation and exchange rate. Hazard risk, we have auto liability and legal liability. Operational risk, we have pollution and environmental risk. And for strategic risk, we have reputational risk, risk of competition, and their mission statement. And this is another image of the risk heat map that we created. It outlines those same risks, but in the priority of how we should handle them. So on the left, we have likelihood, and at the bottom, we have impact. And this just tells you how we feel, how we should prioritize each risk for PepsiCo.
So first I wanted to talk about the strategic risks of PepsiCo. So one being their reputational risk or brand image risk. So PepsiCo has been involved with quite a few scandals over the years. I listed two right here that you may be familiar with: the Kendall Jenner ad or the 349 incident. And obviously those reflect poorly on the brand and the brand image. So we want to be careful moving forward to not be involved in scandals like that. And then also Pepsi is involved in conflict palm oil farming. And that definitely reflects poorly on their brand image and makes them look as though they're a company that doesn't value the environment and the earth that we live on. And I'll go further into that when we get to the environmental issues with PepsiCo. But also PepsiCo creates primarily junk food, which is an issue moving forward because I think there's been a generational shift in the food and beverage industry towards more healthy alternatives. And when a company only produces junk food, it makes them look as though they don't care about their consumers. They don't care about the health and well-being of the people that are eating and drinking their food. So that's definitely something to consider moving forward. And then secondly, we have competition risk. So Coca-Cola is their largest competitor. And I put Coca-Cola's mission statement right there. It's obviously a lot more specific than Pepsi's is, which is definitely an issue. So that's something that we need to change immediately. But Coca-Cola has managed to create this notion that PepsiCo is the off-brand version of Coca-Cola. And that's definitely concerning moving forward because we want to differentiate ourselves from not just the cheaper version of Coca-Cola, but as PepsiCo as it stands just as a competitor of Coca-Cola. And this is just a graph that shows the most valuable soft drink brands worldwide in 2021 based on brand value perceived by consumers. And obviously, as you can see, Coca-Cola is at the top. Pepsi's number 4, and Pepsi's only slightly above Diet Coke, which is just one product that Coca-Cola makes, which is obviously very concerning. And we want to make sure that PepsiCo has a much better brand image moving forward. So next I wanted to talk about the operational risk, which I touched a little bit about on before, but so PepsiCo participates in a lot of environmental exploitation. So they participate in a lot of conflict palm oil farming. So most of their food and beverages have palm oil in them, which is also just a very unhealthy ingredient. So that's concerning as far as the consumers and the brand image that comes along with that. But even standalone, the ways in which PepsiCo acquires its palm oil is concerning. So they participate in deforestation. It displaces communities of people who live in these places. It exploits different countries who don't have the financial and legal means to keep PepsiCo from doing this. And so PepsiCo definitely needs to remove themselves from this kind of conflict palm oil farming. And secondly, we have plastic pollution. So PepsiCo was named in the top 3 of plastic pollutants in the world for, I believe, the 4th year in a row, second only to Coca-Cola and Nestle. And we felt as though this was an opportunity for Pepsi to differentiate themselves from Coca-Cola, not only just in cost, but if Pepsi-Cola can stop their plastic footprint, if they can remove themselves from conflict palm oil, where both of which Coca-Cola is doing, then they can differentiate themselves from Coca-Cola and add value proposition to consumers. It'll better their image, etc. So we felt as though this was a risk, but also an opportunity.
So the first hazard risk that we want to talk about with PepsiCo is their auto liability. PepsiCo has the largest fleet of trucks, beating out large companies like Coca-Cola and Walmart. And with having such a large fleet that gives them higher exposure with their trucks, and that will then lead them into the legal liability, which is the second hazard we have. And PepsiCo has a large exposure in the legal liability because of the nuclear verdicts that have been coming out. There's been nuclear verdicts higher than 100 million, and that could devastate a company even as large as PepsiCo. And so we definitely want to acknowledge the risk that is there with having so many trucks out on the road. And with financial risk, the first risk is exchange rate risk, and you can't control that, but how we want to mitigate the losses is by hedging it with options, contracts, forwards, all those good things that can help minimize the losses that they potentially have. And with inflation risk, this is another thing that PepsiCo can't control, but it's, as we've seen in the last year, food prices have raised 8% and gas prices have risen, which goes back to the owning their trucks. It raises their cost of goods sold, and we think that they should either retain that or try to do a vertical integration strategy in order to mitigate the losses.
So with vertical integration, we were thinking that it would solve several of the problems that we've mentioned in the previous slides. So if PepsiCo was able to buy some parts of their supply chain, then they could almost essentially hedge themselves against the inflation risk that's going on. Because the biggest issue here is that PepsiCo leads with cost, but if there's so much inflation and inflation with their cost of goods sold, and that goes up, well, then they can no longer afford to lead with cost. And then that puts them in a very unique and very dire situation. So they obviously can't pass that inflation like cost onto the consumer because, again, they're leading with cost. So therefore they have to retain that. Well, they can only afford to do that for so long without hedging it in some way. So we felt like if they vertically integrated themselves, then that would be the best way to do that, because then they can own certain parts of the supply chain, lower their cost of goods sold, and maintain that they are the cheapest soda option as compared to Coca-Cola. And also with Coca-Cola in mind, so Coca-Cola is more vertically integrated than PepsiCo is. For example, Coca-Cola owns its own bottling company. So this also is an opportunity for PepsiCo to compete more with Coca-Cola, and definitely like gives them some opportunities there. And then again with vertical inflation, so vertical integration, it helps with inflation. It helps keeps their cost of goods sold down. But also if you're owning certain parts of the supply chain, then you are able to have better quality control and product control. And that can help lower your litigation costs on the back end for product defects and things like that if you're better able to control the product's quality. So lastly, just to sum everything up, the risks that we talked about. So here are some solutions to all of the risks that we mentioned. So we felt as though PepsiCo needs to hire a top of the line PR team as well as a top of the line team of attorneys to handle any indiscretions and monitor the brand reputation and the brand image. And obviously I'm sure that they have something of this nature in place, but they definitely need to make sure that they have a team in place ready to go for any type of scandals. As Nathan mentioned, we need to hedge the exchange rate risk with operating globally. That's not something you can change. PepsiCo operates in 200 countries, so they're going to have to, in some way, face exchange rate risks. So they can hedge against that using currency swaps, futures, forwards, and options. Like I just mentioned, vertical integration, we can retain that high inflation, such as the increasing cost of goods sold. We need to get out of conflict palm oil and other environmentally destructive activities and invest in green alternatives. This will definitely require a lot more investment because it is more expensive to be more environmentally friendly. But we felt as though it would lower the PR costs and the litigation costs on the back end if PepsiCo was able to remove themselves from varying environmentally destructive activities. And then lastly, like I mentioned, to vertically integrate and buy parts of the supply chain to mitigate some of the inflation risks. And we looked into several of the suppliers for PepsiCo. And there are quite a few suppliers, and there are also quite a few that have a smaller market cap and would be very affordable for PepsiCo to acquire. But with all that being said, we wanted to thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.